But this is more
Ja, maar ik ben het wel mee eens.
Any connection? Yes. Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this seminar where we will try to take a look at the recent years' reform aspirations in international sport and see whether it is merely window dressing or if it is real change or a little bit of both. I must say we are really grateful to note how many of you that have come from afar to take part today. Also, I think it's the first event we have organized where the audience is ready much before we are, just sitting and waiting. And I take both things as a kind of token of expectations. We will do our utmost, my colleagues and I, to honor these expectations in the course of the day. Welcome also to Leuven. It's a city with a tumultuous history and an incredible resilience. It's a city that has kept its beauty in spite of numerous bombardings and firestorms over the centuries. In the architecture of this city, from the Gothic cathedral and town hall, the city center, if you haven't seen it, you must go there, and to the power station and data center of the university hospital, you will see how the shifting human ideals and societal norms are reflected in stone, steel, and concrete. They are, literally speaking, written in stone, in contrast to how the shifting ideals and societal norms are getting engraved in our human flesh throughout our history, through movement culture, games, and sport. Modern sport, although it's probably 10 times younger than this historic city, has already gone through a number of storms, especially in the last 2 generations, where scandals seem to fall over sport as the rain falls over Flanders. That's freaky. The question is whether sport and its ideals of human ennoblement through fair competition and unbelievable record breaking will also be able to preserve its beauty for centuries, just as well as Leuven has been able to. In recent weeks, for instance, we have seen the resurrection of a Football Leagues campaign in which around 80 journalists across Europe analyze the content of tens of thousands of documents put at their disposal by an unknown source. Sadly enough, I think very few of us here in the room are really taken by surprise now by the amount of revelations of human trafficking, tax evasions, whitewashing, corruption, mismanagement, and political duplicity that seems to be an integral and perhaps untouchable part of the football industry. And what would we see if we had volleyball leagues, handball leagues, athletics leagues, At Play the Game, we started slowly but steadily to expose the darker sides of sport more than 20 years ago. Thanks first and foremost to hard-headed and courageous journalists, researchers and whistleblowers. It took some years before we heard the word governance for the first time. And it took another few years before we found that this word governance might be a kind of common denominator for the many threats to sports integrity and athlete safety that we were discussing. And as we still say today, good governance of sport may not overcome all the challenges, but without good governance, no challenge will be overcome. Since we gradually understood that the individual governance scandals were of global and systemic nature, we also started to look for global and systemic answers. In 2012 and 13, we were so fortunate to get co-financing from a so-called preparatory action from the European Commission's Sports Unit, and together with 6 European universities and the European Journalism Center, we developed a benchmarking tool called the Sports Gov-ernance Observer. Then, after the project Play the Game in KU Leuven, represented by Arnout Geeraert, whom you will meet on several occasions during the program, we then started applying the tool in 2015, and we used it on all 35 international Olympic federations. Our survey showed, among other things, that 2/3 of the Olympic Federation family did not live up to even half of very basic governance requirements. 3 years later, we have now commissioned Arnout to update the international survey, and since he is very difficult to hold back, he chose to update the whole benchmarking tool, and now it has become much more detailed, and since we only have one researcher working, we have limited ourselves to benchmarking 5 of the major international sports federations this time. This has been possible because some years ago, the Danish Parliament decided to give Play the Game a special grant, a temporary grant, earmarked at our good governance activities. And in a few moments you will learn more about what Arnout found, and we will also have a broader discussion about where international sports governance stands today, with distinguished guests for the debate. Then, after our first studies, we started wondering, but this sleazy governance culture at the top of international sport, where did it come from? Was it installed by some divine inspiration? Was it aliens who had implanted it? Or could it be something that leaders at the international level had brought with them from earlier careers at the national level? And that's why we started to take a look at the national level of sports governance. And in our third attempt, we managed to get a new grant from the EU, this time via the Erasmus Plus program, and that is what has financed our research and today's meeting, most of it. We've spent 2 years designing the tool and applying it on at least 8 major sports federations in 8 European countries, and thanks to this earmarked grant from the Danish Parliament, we could also afford to include 2 more partners, Montenegro and Brazil. It has been an incredibly positive process to work with this team of researchers, sports organizations and other stakeholders from across Europe and Brazil. And I would like to thank on this occasion not only the Erasmus Plus program and the Danish Parliament, but all the members of our group, because they have really worked in a spirit of commitment, enthusiasm, professionalism and fun. I think we should also thank the people from more than 80 federations who assisted us in finding the facts, because among the many facts, this was, at least for me, one of the most surprising. Our research this time in most federations has been welcomed. The federations have actually been curious to see what did we find and how could they use this to improve themselves. In the majority, not all. I've personally been present at national seminars in Poland, Romania, the Netherlands, and my home country Denmark, and it's been so encouraging to see the positive atmosphere. I don't think that would have been possible 5 years ago. So, after these years of research, where are we now? Well, we have two well-elaborated tools, one for the international and the national level, and they are based on the same detailed methodology, which is, by the way, open for you. You can find the tools on our webpage. These tools can be used to make comparisons between sports, between countries, between the national and international level. We also now have a big amount of data on the governance rules and procedures in a wide range of federations. We do not pretend that measuring governance gives you the full picture of the reality of every federation. If you draw a map of a country or the world, you will also not get the full reality of the world. But you will get some very useful indicators, in this case about where are the preconditions best for resisting corruption and promoting democracy. But there's still a need for people with a watchful eye on the inside and the outside of the federations, so we can see how the federations actually behave with their rules and regulations. And last but not least, what we have now is a setup that is independent of the sports organizations that we measure. And in contrast to other governance projects, we are fully transparent about our tools, about how we found our data, and what our data reveal. There's still a lot of work to do. Hopefully, many federations will do their work and be inspired to take a look at the study, even if they're not in it, and see how they can use it to improve. Governments may feel inspired to shape policies that help or push for improvement of sports governance. Stakeholders like athletes groups, sponsors, member associations can use the survey to push for more transparency and dialogue. As for ourselves, we will do our best to continue this benchmarking process, even if our direct support expires by the end of the year. If any of you have ideas about how to fund the future, don't hold them back. We have made a call for all interested researchers to join the benchmarking, and we have had an overwhelmingly positive response. At this stage, we have made new partnerships with researchers and sports organizations from Australia, Canada, Georgia, Lithuania, all of which have representatives in this room. And we are also in the process of including Colombia, Peru, and the US. In principle, there are still around 10,000 sports federations out there that have not been benchmarked yet, perhaps even more. So we are not in shortage of opportunities. My last thanks will go to my hardworking colleagues who have put so much energy into the book you have, the very thick leaflet, and to all of you who have made the effort to travel to Leuven and spend your valuable time with us today. Your presence is our reward, and we hope that when the day ends, you will feel it equally rewarding. Thanks a lot. And I will now introduce one of my brilliant colleagues. That is Christina Friis Johansen, who joined Play the Game last year after spending 12 years with international sport politics in anti-doping Denmark. Christina is our international policy advisor and will take us through the morning's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Also, a warm welcome from my side to Leuven. For those of you who don't know me, I've been working as Jens said for Play the Game for a little over a year now with a background in anti-doping. And I'll be chairing this first session today where we start by having a look at the international level of sports governance. We thought it would be good to sort of start the day at the international level and then later in the day move down to national level and look at how it looks with good governance in national federations. This session will be in two parts. We will start by hearing from Arnout, the update of the Sports Gov-ernance Observer, where he has looked, as Jens said, 5 international federations. It's a session I've been looking really much forward to because, as was also mentioned, we continue to see, as we speak, international sports losing credibility, or at least risking losing credibility from the public and sponsors and other stakeholders in sport. So when Arnout has given us the status quo of the situation, we will hear from some very distinguished guests that we invited to give their perspective on how they view the governance at this moment in international sport. It's going to be very interesting to hear what they believe is the issues confronting us. And to spice it up a little bit, we invited a very well-known investigative journalist who's used to digging up dirt in international federations, and Jens Weinreich will challenge each of the speakers in the second part of the session with at least one or two sharp questions to let them know what it feels like having the ground burning under them from investigative journalists. But first, Arnout, let's kick it off with you, and welcome. The stage is yours.
Does it work now? Yeah. Okay. I'm better at doing research than working with microphones, I promise. So first of all, I would like to welcome you very much in my hometown, Leuven. It is a town where I was born. It is a town where I studied. It is a town where I did my PhD. It is a town where I did lots of foolish things we'll not be discussing here with you today, but I would recommend you, if you have time today, go to the beautiful city center, have a nice beer and enjoy. It really is a very nice, cozy, clean, Flemish town. So I invite you to take a look. Having said that, we're not here to talk about Leuven, of course. I'm a political scientist focusing on sports governance. I focus on two issues. First of all, interactions between governments and sport organizations and the role of governments in steering sports organizations. And secondly, good governance in sport organizations. Today I will be talking about the latter, of course. We're here this morning to talk about international sport federations. The reason for doing so is twofold. First of all, obviously, we have seen quite a few scandals, corruption allegations enveloping international sport federations. I don't think that needs an introduction here with this group. Secondly, however, corruption in sport is not limited to international sport federations. There are issues relating to doping abuse, match fixing, human trafficking, fraud, money laundering, and so on. And although international sport federations cannot tackle these issues alone, they need help from governments, from stakeholders, and so on, they still are very important, pivotal actors in the fight against these issues. In other words, we need effective international sport federations. If we don't have effective international sport federations, we cannot expect these issues to be addressed adequately. So, this is why I would like to start my brief presentation here by answering three basic questions. First question is, how do we make international federations more resistant to corruption? How do we make sure that we see fewer corruption scandals in the future? Secondly, how do we make international federations effective? How do we make sure that these actors are becoming effective actors in the fight against these issues? Doping, match fixing, human trafficking, fraud, money laundering, and so on. Thirdly, as a little bridge to the research, what is the status quo? So let me start by answering the first question: how do we make international federations resistant to corruption. I thought it was very necessary to give you a little bit of background here, because if we want to fight corruption in international federations, we need to understand the problem that we are dealing with. I think if I look at international sports governance in general, I see two reasons why there are increased motives for corruption, motives for different groups of people to engage in corruption. First of all, we have witnessed the enormous commercialization of sport since the 1980s. Put simply, money is flowing into international federations. People working in international federations, senior officials, become very powerful. Whenever that happens in any type of organization, you risk that people will use money to obtain power, or that they will use power to obtain money. You've seen quite a few examples of this in international federations. Secondly, we must also acknowledge that there is an instrumentalization of sport by politics that can have very negative consequences. States and their leaders, particularly emerging countries, regard sport increasingly as a political resource. They know that they can use sport to increase their international prestige. What do they want to do? They want to achieve medals at big sporting events, and increasingly they want to organize big, major sport events. Now, this struggle for medals at big sporting events, that gives prestige, that leads to pressure on athletes. That has led at times to systemic doping abuse, and that has led to the cover-up of doping abuses. If you are a country, you want to achieve medals for your prestige, you do not want people to know that your athletes are being doped. Secondly, these bidding contests to host large sporting events, they have led to cases of bribery. I think we all know about these cases. So, to summarize, increased motives. We cannot do a lot about these motives. What you have to do to decrease the risk of corruption, if you have a lot of motives for corruption, is tackle the opportunities for corruption. You need to make sure that the opportunities for corruption are minimized. Now, if I look at cases of corruption in international sport federations, I see that there are plenty of opportunities for corruption. I think you can categorize them in two groups. First of all, cultural factors group. In many sport federations where there was corruption, you see that corruption was the normal way of doing business. It was not regarded as something illegal, something immoral. It was just the way that things were being done. If you have that, you have a corrupt culture. And if you have that corrupt culture, there's plenty of opportunity for corruption. Secondly, and that will be the focus of today, structural factors. If you do not implement good governance, and that means if you do not make sure that your organization is transparent, that it is democratic, and that you have process of internal accountability implemented in your organization, you risk that when corruption occurs, it is not discovered, and it is also not punished. So, in order to tackle these opportunities for corruption, we need to tackle these cultural factors, but that's very difficult. Cultures change very slowly. So my advice would be, the most cost-effective short-term solution is just making sure that you have governance implemented. Making sure that you have the right structures in your organization so that corruption, when it occurs, it is discovered and subsequently punished. So how do we make international federations resistant to corruption? Implement good governance. You will not eradicate corruption, but you will decrease the opportunities for corruption. Second question, how do we make sport federations, international sport federations, more effective? Also by implementing good governance. We know that making your organization transparent, and that means that you report on your internal workings so that others can monitor your internal workings. By doing that, you make your organization more effective. We know that by making your organization more democratic, and that means that you have competitive elections, that you involve your stakeholders in your policy processes, and that you have open debates in your organization. If you do that, we know that that increases the likelihood that your organization will be effective. We also know that making your organization internally accountable makes your organization more effective. Internal accountability, that refers to, first of all, making sure that no single actor or no single body has complete control over the organization. We sometimes see in international federations, of course. It also means that you establish rules of good conduct, and you make sure that people follow these rules of good conduct. So when they do not follow them, that they are punished, that they face consequences. Finally, implementing societal responsibility makes your organization more effective. What does this refer to? This is about using the potential that you have as a sport organization to have a positive impact on your stakeholders and society at large. Very practically, this is about having policies for match fixing, anti-doping, sexual harassment, environmental sustainability, athletes' rights, human rights, and so on. So how do you make international sports federations more effective? You increase the likelihood of effectiveness if you implement these principles of good governance. To summarize, how do we make international federations effective and resistant to corruption? Implement good governance, makes your organization more effective. Implement good governance decreases the likelihood of corruption. Again, it will never eradicate corruption completely, but you at least decrease the opportunities for corruption. And by decreasing opportunities, you're decreasing the risks of corruption. And then finally, if you implement good governance in a sport organization, sport federation, international sport federation, you increase the trust from governments and stakeholders. Governments, stakeholders trust you more. And because they trust you more, they give you more leeway. And because they give you more leeway, you can be more autonomous. So to summarize, I think good governance, implementing good governance is very important. So the question now becomes, do international federations implement good governance? Do they implement transparency, democracy, accountability, societal responsibility? To answer this question, back in 2015, we developed the Sports Gov-ernance Observer, a benchmarking tool for assessing good governance on exactly those 4 dimensions, to be precise, in international sport federations. Back in 2015, we published the first report in which we analyzed 35 international Olympic sport federations. And as Jens already told us, the scores were pretty low. I will not go into these scores in detail. Today is about the new Sports Gov-ernance Observer. But just to refresh your memory a little bit, these were the average combined scores that the federations, international federations, achieve. Transparency 50%, democracy 45%, internal accountability 42%, societal responsibility 45%. If these numbers don't mean anything to you, let me assure you that these are pretty low scores on very basic standards of good governance. To make this even more clear, this is kind of a ranking that we did. Some people say making rankings is meaningless. I think it is meaningful because here in this red square, you see, as Jens already mentioned as well, all the federations that achieve a good governance score of less than 50%. This is 75% of the 35 international sport federations that we reviewed. Less than 50% on very basic standards of good governance. I mean, there was a big problem. Okay, since 2015, what has happened? We have seen quite a number of governance reforms in international sports governance. You have reforms in individual federations at the behest of ad hoc reform committees, for instance, in FIFA, the IAAF, International Association of Athletics Federations. You also have sectoral policies. The Association of Summer Olympic International Federations now actively encourages and supports the implementation of good governance. They developed key governance principles and basic indicators. And to be very clear, these are very, very positive developments. Nobody can deny that. So what are we doing here today then? If we are making progress, if we are moving into the right direction, why is there a need for a Play the Game conference here in Leuven where we assess these international federations? Well, we know in general, and this is not only true for sport federations, but in general for organizations. The challenge when implementing reforms is to achieve fundamental rather than cosmetic change. The problem is the following one. Implementing good governance in your organization, that has a severe impact. It can change established equilibrium, power equilibrium between people, between stakeholders. And it can restrict seniors, officials' leeway, their influence, their decision-making power. So you will see, always, in any type of organization, when you want to implement reforms, you will have people who have a vested interest in the status quo, people who do not want to change their organization. Especially those that are negatively affected by these reforms. They will have a very strong incentive to minimize change. So you risk that even when an organization reforms, governance reforms may not be sufficiently far-reaching in particular areas. Worst case scenario is that reforms function primarily as public relations ploys that privilege business as usual practices. In other words, in the absence of external pressure, I think this is very important, you will never see fundamental reforms. Not in an entire sector, and quite often not in one single organization. Objective external scrutiny and pressure on organizations is necessary if we want to achieve fundamental reforms. And this is the reason for doing Sports Gov-ernance Observer 2018. A new benchmarking tool for good governance. Compared with the Sports Gov-ernance Observer 2015, we have an improved set of indicators because the indicators were improved to such a large extent. There was no time to review all the 35 federations, so we focused only on 5 major international sports federations. We wanted to provide a transparent, objective, reliable, holistic external assessment of good governance. We wanted to accurately signal governance strengths and deficits to show where are international federations performing well and where should they get the proper credit. But where are the deficits now? Despite these reforms, do we still see deficits? We want to do this to inform policymakers in sports federations, but also governments and stakeholders. And most of all, we want to establish an open discussion, an open debate. One word on the data collection method. We did not rely on self-evaluation. Self-evaluation can never be trusted to provide a reliable picture of the status quo. You need external objective assessment. So we went to the international federations. We researched them. We assessed them. But we needed their cooperation. And I'm very, very happy, and I would very much like to stress this, that FIFA, IAAF, and International Handball Federation were very, very cooperative. They participated in the research, were being very professional, responded to our questions. So I think that's a very, very positive signal. The negative signal is that International Tennis Federation kindly declined cooperation. International Swimming Federation, FINA, never replied to multiple requests. We have different types of federations, of course. We will publish all the scores, all the reasoning behind all the scores. We will publish all the responses from the federations. The idea is to stimulate an open debate here and to avoid futile debates. You weren't assessed well, these kinds of debates. No, we publish everything. You had the opportunity to respond, plenty of opportunity, everything is objective, everything is transparent, everything is open. Right, how did we do this? Very brief word on methodology. You can read about this in detail in the report. There are 4 dimensions. I already introduced those dimensions: transparency, democracy, accountability, societal responsibility. These come from the academic literature. On the basis of academic literature and a bunch of best practices that I collected, I established 57 principles, broad principles of good governance, and I measured these 57 principles by using very clear yes or no indicators. So you have in total 309 questions. Do you implement this? Do you implement this? Do you implement this? Yes or no? The more yeses you score, the better your score is. It's very clear. I think there are quite a few of tools now available. I'm not going to comment on these tools, but I would very much like to highlight the added value of our tool, and that is that it is very reliable. We have a very strict standard. yes or no. Minimum criteria, if you do not reach these minimum criteria, it's a no. If you reach them, it's a yes. It's subjective. We do not rely on self-assessment. Again, we are the ones doing the review. No questionnaires sent to federations. We are the ones investigating them and scoring them. It is easy to use. It's simple yes and no's. It's 309 yes and no questions. It's a lot, but it's yes or no. It's very holistic. Because we use 309 indicators, we go much further than existing tools, I think. We have a very, very broad overview of good governance in international federations. And how we kind of present our scores, I think, is also a very comprehensible method. We used a traffic light scoring system. Basically, the more yeses you score on these principles, the more green your color is in these principles. And I will show it straight away, it will become very clear. So, 50 principles, you have a bunch of yes and no questions for each of these principles. If you have at least 60% of yeses, you achieve a good score on this particular principle, and that's the green color. If you have 80% yeses, that's very good, that's dark green. This is what it looks like. And these are the scores of the federations that we review. So here you see the federations: FIFA, IAAF, FINA, International Handball Federation, International Tennis Federation. Here you see the dimensions: transparency, democratic processes. Here you see the individual principles, 57 in total. The more yeses you have on the quality criteria defined here, the greener your score is here. Immediately you can see that there is a big diversity between the scores in these federations. That makes it very difficult to come up with some very general findings. And I invite you to really take a close look at the federation reports that I wrote into the report so that you can get a very detailed overview. What we can see, for instance, is that federations, they publish their legal and policy documents, their statutes, their internal regulations. You can see that immediately because the colors are quite green. What they not publish, for instance, is conflict of interests and risk assessments. They do not publish, on average, strategic plans. They rarely publish information on the funds that they gave to member federations for development projects, and so on. In the democratic processes dimension, we see that they, on average, have pretty clear election procedures, that they have made progress with, in relation to competitive elections. We also see that they start to implement term limits. I can tell you 5 years ago this was very problematical. Only 6 out of 35 had established some form of term limit. We see here that term limits become more accepted. One of the major problematic areas is the involvement of stakeholders in their policy processes. Athletes, referees, coaches, volunteers, employees. You see that the colors are quite red here. Gender equality policies is also something that is not really implemented in general. Internal accountability, again, there's too much to report here, so I invite you to take a look at the report. But to just highlight a few of these issues. We see that most international sport federations now implement a code of conduct. And these codes of conduct are quite good. They have the criteria that you would expect from a code of conduct. The problem is, for instance, with the enforcement of the code of conduct. Enforcement procedures are not what they should be, independent enforcement, and so on. We see, on average, that they start to implement whistleblower protection rules. Again, 5 years ago, you found no trace of this, so they are starting to implement it, which is good. They don't have independent board members. This is not something that is accepted in these federations. Finally, final dimension, societal responsibility. Here we can be quite brief. On average, the scores are pretty low. We see that international federations, they establish anti-doping policies. And they also establish anti-match fixing policies, but in the other areas, they are quite lacking. And also, they do not establish corruption controls as a funding requirement, meaning that when they give funding to federations or to specific projects, they do not require these federations or projects to implement corruption controls that ensure that they deal with these funds in a decent manner. Okay, briefly, I'm just going to walk you through these scores very, very briefly. You already managed to establish, I think, that FIFA is kind of outperforming the other federations that we reviewed. They achieved the highest SGO index score compared to the other federations. They achieved the highest transparency score with regard to democratic processes. Only the International Association of Athletics Federations is scoring better. Societal responsibility score, they outperform the other federations. And here, societal responsibility, you can see that this is quite problematical. Also worrying, I think, is that transparency is at quite a low level in 3 of the federations that we reviewed. So let's take a look at these federation scores very briefly. I already mentioned FIFA is kind of outperforming the other federations. They achieve rather decent scores on average, especially with regard to transparency, internal accountability, societal responsibility. Democracy is a bit still at an average level. They could make improvements. Now, just the fact that they achieve green scores here does not mean that there is no area for improvement. Quite the contrary, there is a lot of room for improving further. I think on the positive side, and we should also highlight the positives here, they are now publishing detailed information on the remuneration of board members, term limits they have installed, they have female representation on board, they have financial controls, good external audit, improved bid procedure for the World Cup. They have on paper a good functioning ethics committee. What they do not have is they do not publish conflicts of interest of board members. They do not publish their corruption risk assessments. There are no clearly defined strategies for involving different stakeholder groups. There is no annual board self-evaluation. There is an inadequate supervision of the board by the General Assembly and of management by the board. There are no independent board members. There are inadequate conflict of interest procedures, and there is no clearly defined strategy for societal responsibility. So again, decent scores, especially when you compare them to the other federations, but still a lot of room for improving. This is why you need a detailed assessment. If you just use a broad assessment, you will never be able to uncover these areas where these organizations can still improve. Okay, briefly the other federations. I think it was worthwhile focusing a little bit more on FIFA. International Association of Athletics Federations. There have been very positive improvements here. This organization is still in the process of implementing governance reforms. And to their credit, I think that the reforms that they plan to implement, if they actually implement them in the next 2 years, you will see a significant enhancement of these scores. Where we are right now is that they are not being transparent, not enough. Their democracy, internal accountability, societal responsibility is at a decent average level. Again, a lot of room for improvement. More room for improvement in the other federations that we reviewed. International Swimming Federation, again, they did not participate in the research. Had they participated in the research, they could have provided more information. Perhaps their scores would have been a little bit higher. I do not expect that these scores would rise significantly. I think there are problems in this international federation. International Handball Federation, compared to the assessment we did 5 years ago, has made some very good improvements with regard to democracy and internal accountability. Organization is certainly not transparent enough, and with regard to societal responsibility, there are still problems. And then finally, the International Tennis Federation, decent in the transparency dimension, lacking in the democracy, internal accountability, and especially societal responsibility. So let me take you very briefly now to finish this presentation to a few general conclusions that we can make on the basis of this assessment. Importantly, I think the devil is in the detail. I cannot stress this enough. Sometimes you see that on the surface, federations seem to implement good governance. They have particular governance requirements that they are starting to implement. When you look deeper you see that these improvements often lack quality. And I think this is the true added value of a holistic, external, independent assessment, that you can really uncover these areas. There is a lack of board accountability. The boards, executive committees of these organizations are not adequately held to account by the General Assembly. There is a lack of strategic planning, which is striking. There are no clear strategic plans that outline objectives, envisioned actions, limited stakeholder involvement, no real strategies for involving stakeholder groups. A number of standards are not expected. So on average, you see improvements on a different areas of good governance. You don't see a lot of improvement with regard to independent board members, publishing corruption risk assessments or conflict of interests, obligatory anti-corruption controls for funded entities, and board self-evaluations. And on average, with the exception of FIFA perhaps, you don't see adequate reporting. There is no reporting on policy plans, board decisions, allocated funds, and so on. So I would say implementing good governance, it does take time. We need to give federations the time to implement this. But being transparent does not take that much time. And I would advise federations to, in their short-term policies on good governance, to make their organizations transparent. Publish your documents. That's not that difficult, is it? How come that we see like 20% scores on the transparency dimension? That I cannot understand. I can understand that you have 45% in accountability because you're in the process of evolving. But publishing your documents, that's easy. Everybody can do it. So finally, the hope is that more federations will be willing to engage in external SGO benchmarking. There is a need. If we have no pressure, there will be no fundamental reforms. I think external benchmarking provides a valuable first step for truly improving international sports federations' governance. And by facilitating an open debate on objective data, I think we can make important steps. And I think international sports governance can only benefit from an open discussion about good governance. And my final sentence is a big thank you to Play the Game for supporting these projects now for 6 years. So without your support and funding, this would not be possible. And I think it's important that we have an organization like Play the Game funding this research. As researchers, we need funding. So thank you very much for that.
I think we should clarify any questions on the floor to Arnout while he's up here. So is anyone having a question that he usually wants to clarify at this moment? Over here.
Hi there, Maggie Murphy from the Sport Integrity Global Alliance. A really quick question, and that's just simply why did you choose those 5 federations, and which ones would you like to look at next?
We chose these federations because in our National Sports Governance Observer project, which will be introduced this afternoon, we had 5 federations that every partner needed to look into. So we defined 5 common sports that everybody would take a look into in order to make comparisons between types of federations. This is why when we looked into international, or we made the decision to also look into international federations, we said, well, it would be very interesting to take these same 5 sports so that we can make comparisons between the scores of these 5 international federations and the scores of the same types of federations in 9 European countries and Brazil. So the reason for choosing these federations was to be able to make comparisons with the national level. Why did we choose these 5 federations? Well, we had an internal debate within the context of our National Sports Governance Observer project. Different federations were suggested. We selected them on the basis of their importance within the Olympic Games in general and their importance for sports governance in Europe. So, okay, it's a subjective choice, of course, always. We needed to start somewhere, so these are the 5. Which ones would I like to take a look at next? I don't have a particular preference. I just hope that we have external benchmarking for all international sport federations. I really think that they can only benefit from it. And again, I experienced very, very cooperative staff members in organizations like FIFA, and I could sense that perhaps they really want to reform, and sometimes they need a little push to reform even further. So establishing an open debate is constructive for any international sport federations. I don't have a particular preference.
Paulina Tomczyk from EU Athletes. I have a question about FINA, because I think it's interesting to look at their governance in relation to the current events of their conflict with World Swimming Association and the fact that they are preventing athletes from taking part in events organized by another association, and they actually have rules that prevent athletes from engaging with those associations and competing there. I'm just wondering, I think it's a more broader governance problem when they are using these illegal rules to try to keep their monopoly. I'm just wondering if this kind of behavior, this kind of rules, is it something that we would find somewhere in the indicators that you are looking at?
No, I didn't include that specifically, and to be honest, I think it's a very pertinent issue, because we have seen quite a few international federations doing that. In this particular research, we did not include it. I am, however, convinced that were this organization more transparent, more democratic, if athletes were able to have a say in the policy processes, you would not see these kind of problems. So everything is kind of interconnected. But specific answer to your specific question, it is not included. But I do acknowledge it is a very important issue, and I hope that the EU will take necessary measures there.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. It's Tracy Taylor from Australia. And I know this isn't explicit in the research that you were doing, but I would just be interested in your view, and it may be difficult to say given the lack of strategic plans that you found within each of the federations, but if there was a stated mission and stated goals from the Federation about what they wanted to achieve within any quadrennial, did you see any relationship between success in the organization in achieving those and the level of good governance assessment that you did?
That's a very good question. First of all, I didn't really look into the impact of having these principles implemented, yes or no. What we did witness is that not only did they not implement clear strategies, setting out objectives and actions, they also did not make evaluations of their strategies. Well, of course, this was also a requirement in the benchmarking instrument. Had they done this, it would be much easier to hold them to account, because we would be able to see, right, they say that they're going to do this in the next 4 years. To what extent have they succeeded? Well, do your own internal evaluation and tell us. It's very much possible, or very likely, that you will not succeed on every one of these goals that you set, but be transparent about that. So I think that's the first step that they need to take in order for us then to take a look into, are they really doing what they are saying? Now it's almost impossible, or you would have to do very in-depth research, and the time frame was too limited to do that. But certainly a pertinent question.
Thank you very much, Arnout. Please join me giving Arnout another hand. Arnout is going to be around for the whole day, so if you have any other questions relating to the international study, I'm sure you can catch him during the break. We now move into the second part of this morning session, where we will have short presentations from 4 speakers. The first one is Brett Clothier from the athletics.
Better at doing this.
That's what he started with, right?
Brett Clothier is the head of the Athletics Integrity Unit, which was established by the IAAF last year, I believe, in 2017. And this is a very interesting new initiative from an international federation establishing an independent unit to manage or govern integrity issues in sport. There's this phrase that has been used quite a lot recently with foxes guarding hen houses, and I would say that the IAAF made a first move to actually separate the fox from the hen house, making sure that the International Federation does not police itself in integrity issues. So I think it's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Brad. Please, floor is yours.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. If there are foxes and hen houses, I'm not sure what I am exactly, but I'll tell you a little bit about the reform process at the IAAF, the role of the Athletics Integrity Unit, and what we do and what we hope to achieve, and hopefully that can stimulate some great discussion with the other panel members later on. So I probably don't need to tell this crowd all about the corruption issues that beset the IAAF a few years ago, but it was, I guess, the classic case, a case study of what not to do in governance. The president of the federation was corrupt, and was taking bribes from athletes to cover up doping offences, among many other things. So this incident was uncovered by some very great work from some journalists, and it created a huge crisis within the IAAF. And from this crisis came the opportunity and the motivation for reform. And I think a very strong reform process was undertaken. The governance reforms of the IAAF created the Athletics Integrity Unit. The Athletics Integrity Unit was created through changes to the IAAF Constitution, which required a 2/3 majority of the Congress to pass. So these changes aren't easily reversible, is the first point to get across. They were hard enough to get through in the first place, despite the obvious need for them. But the great thing is they're there now. So the Constitution creates the body called the Athletics Integrity Unit. Our remit is to govern all integrity issues in the sport of athletics, not just doping, but corruption of officials, match fixing, and any other general misconduct or fraud in the conduct of athletics. The functions of our team are to not just to investigate these matters, but also to prosecute offences in the independent tribunals that were also set up under the reform process. So the independence of the AIU, as I said, is enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution says in black and white that the AIU shall be operationally independent of the IAAF. It creates an independent board for the Athletics Integrity Unit. The Athletics Integrity Unit board has 3 independent members, who are the only 3 voting members. The chairman of the board is David Howman, the former Director General of WADA. Andrew Pipe, Dr. Andrew Pipe is the other independent member, along with Mark Clothier. There is a IAAF council member who is appointed by the council to sit on the Athletics Integrity Unit board, who is Abby Hoffman. She is a non-voting member, and I'm the 5th member of the board, also non-voting. So the board itself is appointed by an appointments panel process, so it's not directly appointed by the IAAF Council The appointments panel includes one member of, it's a little bit complex with the legal tools and phrase, but more or less the appointments panel includes one member of council, one independent person, and one other athletics integrity unit board member. So that appointments panel makes recommendations to the IAAF election congress every 4 years to appoint the athletics integrity unit board members. An interesting question I often get is, how is the athletics integrity unit funded? We are funded through the IAAF. Our funding at the moment is $8 million US per year, which is probably about 12% of IAAF revenues, which is quite a substantial amount, relatively speaking. I often get asked, how can you be assured of your independence if you're funded by the IAAF? It's a good question, but there is such a thing as too much independence. I think I sort of look at this as our operational independence is enshrined, but to have our be able to perform our functions and our role, we need funding, and it's the IAAF who are providing that funding. Much like a police force that operates independently in a democratic country, we have our operational independence ensured by the constitution of the IAAF, but we are accountable for how we spend our money and our performance at a strategic level to the citizens of that country, if you will. There's no point asking the citizens of France to fund the police force of Belgium, and I think that's the way I view this, but it's a very interesting discussion point. And I think what I do like about this reform process is that it was the athletics industry themselves deciding we need to make change and we need to create this body, fund them well, and give them the operational independence they need to do their job. So a little bit about our structure. To perform these functions, the athletics integrity unit, it's close to 20 staff now, will be soon. We have an investigations and intelligence team of 6 persons. We have a testing team. Anti-doping is a very large part of our work by the nature of the industry. The testing team is 5 persons. We have an internal case management team of 4, 1 person for education and communication, myself and office manager, and there are a couple more persons soon to come. We've been in operation since April 2017. I commenced at the unit as the head of the unit in August 17. Since that time, when I came, there were 5 people, so we've built very quickly, and we've sought to establish our capability. So it's great to be, we have the freedom of our independence, but we must, above all, be effective in what we do. So we've really sought to build very strong capability with a high-level management team capable, especially of investigating in a completely international environment, which is what athletics is. 2 more things before I finish. I guess I can tell you something about the experience of all this in practice over the first, my 12 months and a little bit more. I think the reforms work very well from what I've observed today. The IAAF itself and the staff at the IAAF are extremely respectful, and in fact a little fearful of, in a good way though, of our independence. There's never ever been a single moment of trying to encroach on our territory from any of the people I deal with at the IAAF. The separation works extremely well. In my role, I report to David Howman as the chairman, and there's no reporting lines in any way to any other person at the IAAF over any matter. We're very excited by the reform process. We think this is a unique governance structure in sport. Our unit is the only one of its kind in all sport. I think having the liberty to pursue what matters we want to, and having the resources to do so, we're uncovering, or scratching the surface and uncovering a lot of concerning things in athletics, to be frank. And I'm sure this would not be an unusual experience in any other international federations if they went through a similar reform process. Finally, before I leave you, I just wanted to say that the reform process wasn't just about the Athletics Integrity Unit. The IAAF created also further checks and balances, including checks and balances on our powers and authority in the reform process as well, such as a vetting panel, an independent vetting panel. So all IAAF officials, all Athletics Integrity Unit officials must go through a vetting process as a condition of their being employed, and have a continual obligation to pass that vetting process. There's also created independent bodies such as the Disciplinary Tribunal, to which we prosecute our cases. So the reform process will continue as pointed out previously in 29 Constitution is an updated Constitution that creates broader reforms within the IAAF for a executive board to be formed with independent members. So the reform process is continuing at the IAAF. I won't keep you any longer. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. As I warned you in the beginning, you would be hit immediately by a sharp question from our investigative journalist, Jens Weinreich. So I'm going to give the mic to you, Jens. What's your question for Brett?
It actually is not only a question for Brett, it's also for Arnaud. I heard you use the C word corruption a few times, right? It sounds little bit like playing down the reality. I mean, why wouldn't you use the right C word, crime? We are talking about international organized crime.
Yes. Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And the crime perpetrated was extraordinary, and it continues to be investigated in jurisdictions all around the world by the people involved in France and Brazil. Coming in to my role a year ago and looking at what took place and continuing to look at it, it's hard to believe what was going on in those times, but it certainly was a crime, an international crime, for sure.
Thank you. You actually said in your beginning that you didn't know what you would be in terms of the fox guarding the hen house, but you did answer you were the police, sort of. So my just follow-up question would be, do you feel you have the necessary measures to do crime investigations, or how are your possibilities to actually do that work?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We have very strong investigative powers, thanks to the reform process. We actually went to the IAAF Council earlier this year to enhance our powers in two important respects. And the IAAF Council passed important rule changes to enhance those powers. So the first was to stiffen our powers to seize documents, records, electronic records from people under investigation under a particular process. And that's been carried out a number of times so far this year. So we have as far as sport goes, we have very strong investigative powers. We have the right people involved in that unit. It's very difficult in the international context. Athletics is the most international sport there is. We have to investigate. At the last London World Championships, there were 26 different countries won medals and 26 different countries won gold medals. and 40-something countries won medals. So my team has to be able to go to investigate in Africa, the Middle East, South America, all over the world. So we recruited the right type of people with experience in international crime, security services, who can conduct that sort of work and know how to conduct that sort of work. So I think we have a very effective investigative function. We have to work closely with law enforcement and other organisations around the world to pull it off. But I think in this space, there is certainly a role for sport rather than just sitting. I don't like hearing sport sitting back and saying that's a crime. I'm leaving that to the law enforcement's job. I mean, sport I think has to step up and play its part. And then there's an important interface with law enforcement. You know, that's the way to the best results.
Thank you so much, Brett, for your good presentation. Thank you. Okay, the next speaker is Stanislas Frossard from EPAS, the Enlarged Partial Agreement on Sport. And EPAS is an intergovernmental institution working under the Council of Europe in sport. And EPAS is very much engaged in good governance and issues relating to ethics in sport. So we'll hear from Stan what those initiatives involve, and looking forward to that.
Thank you very much, Christina. Does it work? Can you hear me? No. Maybe. Thank you. Okay, it's my pleasure to share with you some report on what we are doing with EPAS, which is a group of countries involved on sports politics from the Council of Europe, but also in cooperation with other countries, other governments, international organizations, and sports organizations. And I would like to report in particular on IPAX, which is the International Against Corruption in Sport, which is an important initiative, which is stemming from a number of calls that were expressed in the year 2016-17. There was a UK anti-corruption summit, there was a Council of Europe Conference of Ministers in Budapest, and there was also International Sport Integrity Forum organized by IOC, and all these meetings said there is a need for a coalition, a multi-stakeholder coalition, gathering government, sports organization, international organization to work on good governance, fight against the risk of corruption in sport. And the initiators were Council of Europe, OECD, IOC, UK government, and it was set up as an informal setting, consensus driven. And the three partners of IPAX are states, governmental authorities, sports movement, and international organization. There is some a steering committee gathering representatives from the stakeholders, and the steering committee established three task forces. And the first is on working on how to reduce the risk of corruption in public procurement in the context of major sports events, an area which is obviously relevant for the governmental authorities that are investing a lot in infrastructures and bids for international competition. The second is how to ensure transparency and integrity in the awarding of a process of sports event selection. Here again, it's very relevant for governments as well, because they are supporting bids and investing in that kind of campaigns. And the third one is how to promote the convergence of the existing good governance frameworks. That's the one which is coordinated by the Council of Europe. In addition to the steering committee and the task forces, there is a core group bringing together Council of Europe, OECD, IOC, UK government, and UNODC. And I hope that at some stage, hopefully in 2019, there will be a plenary meeting allowing every interested government and sport organization, international organization, to be part of this movement. And there is a new meeting that will take place on 6th of December in London. Maybe you have heard of it, which is an high-level meeting of the entities represented in the steering committee. I won't enter in the present setting of the steering committee, but the scope of IPACS is definitively to focus on the risk of corruption, to share knowledge, to exchange information, and to improve the coordination between the different groups of stakeholders. Its assets is a commitment from the key stakeholders, including the leading international sports organization, its international dimension, and its potential to facilitate the process towards common benchmark between international sports movement and government. Because so far, the governments and the sports movement worked in two parallel works, and there was no consultation and agreement on these good governance benchmark. And I will enter more in details while commenting task force 3. The risk of IPACS is to find the right balance between inclusiveness and the balance between the continents, the organization. If it were an inclusive open setting, we would have on the spot 20, 30 European countries eager to take part in this process, but at the same time it would be depicted as a Eurocentric movement, and it's quite a challenge to achieve this balance. Then the transparency of the work which is conducted within IPACS, visibility and ownership. I mentioned it with the setting up of the plenary meeting of IPACS. Now I will comment on the convergence of benchmarks, common benchmark on good governance in sport. It's only a part of the measures to be promoted to fight against corruption in sport. In addition, of course, it's very important to enhance the prosecution of corrupt behaviors, and that's an area on which we are challenging the governments to do their homework, to have appropriate criminal legislations, and to put the appropriate resources to investigate and prosecute corrupt behaviors, even if they occur in private business and in particular in sport. It's also important to have implementation of good governance measures at all levels. It's not only something for the high-profile international organizations which are hitting the headlines, but and in this sense, I welcome the National Sports Gov-ernance Observer, which is also moving things at national level, because we consider that good governance is something that should be mainstream everywhere in sport at all levels. Then it's important to have review, monitoring, compliance, which is checking whether the features, the behaviors in the organization are in line with the benchmarks, and some support measures to assist the sports organization to enhance their governance. What is expected from a common benchmark? This common principle is first of all to have increased coherence and not to have different requirements coming from the international sports movement and from the governments. If we consider the situation of a national sport federation, it may face requirements from the international sports movement, its international federation, but at the same time from its government, which has some requirement to grant subsidies. And it is very important to agree on what makes sense in terms of governance to avoid conflicting requirements, in particular at this level. It's also to strengthen the consensus, because as I mentioned, there was so far not much dialogue between the international sports movement and the government on what are the key features of good governance in sport. And the decision made within IPACS was to focus on core governance issues which are relevant to mitigate the risk of corruption, and it was decided to start with term limits, financial transparency, and prevention management of conflict of interests. So for the time being, there are many benchmark standards, guideline indicators which are different in purpose. Some are mostly guidelines, recommendations, declarations. Some are compulsory requirements, and some are evaluation methodologies, such as the indicators which were presented by Arnout. And they also differ in the level of operationalization. Some are only mentioning some principles: democracy, accountability, transparency, Well, the consensus is quite easy at this level of principles. Everybody agrees. Some are going further in the area of intervention. It means to have term limits, it means to have integrity policy, and a few are formulating a specific requirement. And in IPAX, what we decided is to focus on a specific measure, not to start another general discussion on principles, but to come to very concrete measures that should be used to measure the good governance of sports organization at all levels. Of course, the challenge will be not to produce another piece of paper which is not implemented, and our hope is that these benchmarks, these indicators will be streamlined, will be used by Sports Gov-ernance Observer, ASOIF, by the national charter that are implemented at national level as a real common benchmark. Of course, the indicators are not compulsory. IPAX has no teeth to sanction those organizations that won't comply with these benchmarks, but it can create a movement towards the use of this benchmark in the evaluation. Its strength is to reflect an agreement between government, international organization, and sports movement. And the intention is to produce indicators that are easy to transpose in the existing framework at national and international level. And the thematic scope, I mentioned it's term limits, financial transparency, and conflict of interest, but the intention is to suggest to extend this scope when we will be over with the production of these indicators. And I would like to end with this slide. It is how it is expected to impact the governance, because of course a snapshot, an evaluation of the situation of the governance of an organization as such, it's not very helpful. But what's very important is that it starts moving the organization, because it's recurring, and the organization knows that maybe the year after the ASOIF self-assessment, there will be another ASOIF self-assessment, that a few years after a Sports Governance Observer, there will be another Sports Governance Observer, and they want to better perform in the next one. And then they are starting reform to consider what could be improved to achieve a higher compliance this, and to change the statutes, the legal obligation, the requirement for membership, and so on. And here again, the indicators are expected to inspire the organization in this reform process. And very important is to accompany and to assist, to support the organization in this. But we are observing that there is now a very meaningful movement, at least at international level, but in many countries at national level. You mentioned that you assessed 10 countries with the National Sports Governance Observer. We collected good governance from 15 countries which have introduced a review of good governance at national level. And in most of these countries, in most of these international federations, there is now a real commitment to improve the situation. Of course, the critical questions will be that it should, at some stage, it will reach some political decisions, and I'm not sure that the political leaders of all sports organizations will be committed to supportive to make in-depth reforms, but it's very important to keep evaluating the sports organization. I thank you for your attention, and I'm available for provocative or less provocative questions from our colleagues.
Thank you, Stan. We'll take a provocative question right away.
I hate that word, it's not... So I quote you, you said we are challenging the governments and doing their homework, right? So I just recently have spoken to some prosecutors. They complained on the IOC and IOC's willingness to support them. That's why my question is, are you challenging your partner IOC as well to do homework and do not block investigations?
Yes, of course. We are not involved in the discussion between prosecutors, investigators and the IOC. But I think as an intergovernmental organization, I believe there is much to do to enhance the criminal legislation and policy for countries to be able to investigate and prosecute private corruption. And that's an hypothesis we made a few years ago, but it was not welcomed by the experts committee from ministries of justice so far. And now for 2 years we have a very constructive cooperation with GRECO, which is the intergovernmental body on anti-corruption policies, and they recognize that there are loopholes, there are gaps in the criminal legislation. Now, whether sports organizations are cooperative in investigation, I cannot, I don't have detailed information on this, but I would be interested in identifying both governments which are not cooperative and working and playing the game of judicial cooperation, and sports organizations which are hiding information and preventing investigation to take place.
Thank you so much, Stan. We now turn to an athletes organization. I think it cannot have escaped anyone's attention that there's currently a huge movement going on where athletes are increasingly speaking up, organizing themselves in various groups, and giving their views on the sports governance situation. And therefore we're very proud to have Paulina Tomczyk with us today. Paulina is the Secretary General of EU Athletes and represents athletes, so we'll hear what you have to say, Paulina, both on the governance situation in general in sport, but also if you could give us a few words on what's going on right now with the athletes movement.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay? Thank you very much, Christina. Yes, I think I will start right away with the situation with athletes representation, because it seems like it has been a very hot topic for the last weeks or months, especially with the Russia decision and the different reactions that we saw from athletes, from those bodies, from IOC Athletes Commission and Athletes Committee, as well as the organized athletes that we represent and other groups that I will get into after. Athletes representation, of course, is very important, as every athlete has the right to be represented by the people of their own choosing on the matters that affect them. And it is also related to human rights, such as freedom of association and right to organize and collectively bargain. I would like to point out, I think those who followed maybe the speech of President Tomczyk Bach during the General Assembly last week in Spain, I believe, he does believe that the athletes' representation within the sports organization is the only legitimate one, trying to undermine a little bit the views of the independent organizations, which I think that shows, well, that shows a bit his lack of understanding of what actually those organizations are doing, and it is definitely not beneficial to the movement. So I think we hear a lot about athletes representation, and that it's very complicated. There are so many different athletes groups. From my perspective, and I'm not a researcher, it's just a general remarks, there are two types of those organizations. There's first one, which are the athletes committees or athletes commissions that exist within sports organization, and the second one are the independent organizations, whether these are trade unions, as EU athletes and our members, or something like the organization created in Germany, for example, that represents more the Olympic athletes, but still trying to be as independent as possible. So when it comes to athletes committees, from my perspective, they will always have certain limits. It's because they are internal committees of the organizations they are in. For example, IOC Athletes Committee, or any committee of any sports federation at international or national level. So there are rather consultative bodies, and they also get most of their funding, or all of their funding, those sports federation, who are also able to, in a way, determine their actions that they can take and how much they can actually do. At the same time, the athletes that are involved there are doing their, are taking their position as an athlete representative most of the time as something additional to their other job or their other occupation. So they will never be able to give that much time and that much expertise to that work, in my opinion, and will not be able to actually seek consultation from all the athletes around the country, around the sports, in a organized matter. As we could have seen specifically with the IOC Athletes Commission and WADA Athletes Commission, well, when it comes to IOC, the athletes there are actually IOC members, and we have seen on many occasions that it seems that they are representing more the views of IOC than the athletes themselves. If we look at the chair of IOC Athletes Committee, whose name I just forgot. Christina, who's the chair of Athletes Committee, but at the same time she's the she's the sports minister in her home country, and also wears a few different hats within the IOC movement. I think it is really difficult in this way to really stay focused on representing athletes' rights, and also I believe that representing athletes' rights is a full-time job. I honestly do not think she has the time to do that in a meaningful way. Another very big problem from my perspective is the IOC always focuses on the fact that the representatives are elected, which is true, most of them are elected, but at the same time, once they are elected, there is no mechanism, as far as I know, for athletes to hold them responsible for their actions. So once they're elected, they're pretty much free to do what they want, and we often see that it seems more that they wish to continue their career within the IOC, going to different positions, rather than actually focus on representing athletes. And on the other hand, athletes representatives from WADA, they are not elected. They are picked by the IOC, by the Olympic movement, and the representatives from government in a not very clear procedure when the conditions are not clearly stated. And as we have seen with the decision on Russia, they don't really have a real power. So WADA says that the Athletes Committee is the athletes representation they have, but without getting into details about the Russia decision, I find it very negative that there is a huge decision taking place. Athletes representation express very clearly that they have an opinion about it, and this is completely dismissed. So this is certain issues that I would say we have with this type of representation. And that is why the organization like mine exists, actually. We believe more in the independent representation of athletes, with the members who also are elected and are independent from sports organizations, and who actually are doing athletes representation as a full-time job. And something that is very important for us, it's not only to represent athletes, but also to report them, to support them through different programs and through education, through about anti-doping, about match fixing, and also personal development. And because those organizations are more professional and more independent, there is also a strong system of consultation. Each athlete will be met by the athlete's representative at least once a year. Often that would be much more than that if they are involved in different programs, which really allows us to get the athlete's voice and really bring it up at the different level. And in many countries where the organization like this exists, they will have a very high level of membership, around 90%. But of course, there is a big problem with this kind of organization, because in order to create something like that, you actually need athletes to take ownership of their own situation. It has to be created by athletes themselves. And this is something that takes a lot of time, and sometimes it's difficult, and the attitudes from the sports federation does not help. If they are dismissive of this kind of of this kind of organization. But we would hope that the sports organization and Olympic committees would understand the added value of this kind of organization, that through the specific relationship that they have with athletes can really bring benefit to the governance of sport. And this is something that is extremely important from my perspective, because athletes are the main stakeholders in sport, and sport can exist without the officials, but cannot exist obviously without the athletes. And I think that the reforms related to governance should also focus very much about athletes, putting the athletes first, respecting their human rights and respecting their labor rights, as well as their health, safety, and well-being, again, involving in decision-making process, and taking into account that sports career is very short, high risk, that the duty of care of sports organization is even bigger because of that. And I think it is pretty clear that in the last years sport has really changed, and it's becoming more and more a commercial activity. At the same time, we are hearing from the side of IOC and other representatives of the Olympic movement very negative comments related to commercial events or commercial activities. But the reality is that IOC is making billions of euros on their events, and so they are clearly involved in a commercial activity. But the problem is, while the IOC members get paid to go to the Olympic Games, athletes do not get paid at all to compete there, and also because of some rules, such as Rule 40, they are not able to commercialize their rights. And I think this is a huge problem. It is not something that will make the headlines of the newspapers, because it is not a great corruption scandal or a crime. But actually, there are thousands and thousands of athletes who are really struggling to make their living because of the system that we have, and the system that is protected by the Olympic Committee under this banner of European sport model, and the need for solidarity system and the protection of grassroots sport and so on. But I think the way that the athletes are treated at the highest level, the professional athletes and the elite level athletes, who actually need to sacrifice a huge part of their life if they even have the slightest chance to reach their dreams and to get to the top of their sport discipline, it shouldn't be a controversial issue that they should be paid for the work that they're doing for the sports organization. And they should be able to get a fair share of the revenue that they help create. And because it's really unacceptable to put them in a position where they cannot meet their ends, if they have to take another paid job because they cannot make any money out of their sport, or just because they have to quit their sport before they reach their full potential, because simply they cannot afford to continue their professional career anymore. I didn't get to, so there are so many issues related to that, but I see Christina already pressuring me with time, so thank you very much.
One question for you as well, from Jens.
You are so smart, Christina. Paulina, you have already answered my question because you were talking about Thomas Bach. So, according to him and the IOC leadership, since EU Athletes is not a democratically elected body and you have no right to speak for athletes. So, what makes your organization special, and for how many athletes and how many countries would you say you can speak?
Mm-hmm. So we represent around 25,000 athletes from 18 countries in Europe, it's 15 EU countries, and 35 members from different countries and different sports. And we are democratically elected. Me, myself, I am not, because I am staff. I am appointed by the board of EU athletes, who was democratically elected. Actually, the difference is, in my opinion, that the elections are being held closer to athletes because they do elect, for example, let's take an example of basketball player association from France. They have around 500 members, so those members have an opportunity to vote for the president and for the board. And this is someone they know actually, because of the system that I explained before, of the athletes representative and the team visits. They actually know who they are voting for. And then if they have a problem with this person, they are also able to take certain measures to change the leadership. And then those people, those leadership of our members that have been elected, they vote within EU athletes for our board and for our president and vice president, who are elected. At the same time, staff is appointed. But I still believe that the system that we have with this not direct, but actually more close democratic elections give us a good voice to represent organized athletes.
Thanks again, Paulina, very much. Very interesting to hear from athletes' perspective. Is that a hand in the back?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Can we just wait till the panel? We have one more speaker, and there will be opportunities to ask that question later. And the next speaker, if you don't already follow his Twitter account, I strongly recommend that you follow him immediately. It's Nick Butler, the investigative journalist who has a background writing on corruption in the IOC and international federations for Inside the Games. Now he joined Hajo Seppelt in the RID doping editorial team. So he's one of those who has been digging in the mud, assisting in the disclosure of scandals in sports. So I thought we would finish off with Nick giving his perspective on how sport is going to manage all these corruption, crime scandals. At least your perspective, Nick, please.
Thank you for the Twitter plug, Christina. Good governance for me is one of those buzzwords you hear a lot about from sports leaders. You'll often see it in press releases and speeches, like other phrases like zero tolerance on doping, athlete-centered games. And it sounds very good, but in my experience of covering most of the international federations and the IOC, I would say it's more of a PR exercise. It's something they like to say and to give the impression that they take very seriously, largely to maintain the status quo. So by saying that they are committed to good governance, that justifies them maintaining their power base and maintaining the ability to police themselves and stopping any external body getting involved. I think some of these reforms we've spoken about earlier are good, but I think I would tend to say it's more window dressing than a profound change. And the underlying problem for me is the culture of sports, which hasn't really changed, certainly in the time that I've been covering it. And I think if you compare the running of international sport with a political regime, it would have a lot more in common with an authoritarian country than a liberal democracy. So take the structure of a sports body. So you've got a president, often not subject to term limits, and they're not elected by the equivalent of the public or athletes. They're elected by usually a body of about 100, 200 members or national federation representatives who are fully integrated into the system. So these people often enjoy their lifestyle, they enjoy the prestige it gets them in their own countries. Often they have ambitions to rise up the ladder and make a career of it. Paulina described that really well in relation to athletes' commissions. And this creates a system of patronage where presidents and sports leaders are very good at making it implicitly clear that if you don't do what we want, you won't survive. And if you do, you can go a long way. They also, as far as elections are concerned, IFs have the weapon of development funding, which they're very good at using as what some would call a bribe to get what they want. And in addition to that, you have an administration which isn't really like a political civil service in the sense it's not independent, and an administrative staff member is usually completely under the influence of the President or the Secretary General, so if they don't do what the President wants, they won't stay in their position. So all of this creates a fairly weak system where you have a very, very powerful President. You have a weak executive committee, a weak Congress. I don't know if anyone's followed IOC sessions recently, but it often looks like a group of yes men just doing whatever Thomas Bach wants them to. And it's easy to see how this structure creates the sort of governance we saw in the IAAF under the media, where there's no restriction on the President at all. So that's the structure. The second part, I would say, is the methods of scrutiny that these sports bodies have. So generally, when there's a crisis, they will respond by setting up some sort of body like CAS or WADA or the ITA, which is independent in sorts, but is still under the at least partial control of sport. So it stops any external regulator coming in. Ethics commissions are a really good example of this. And I think the Athletics Integrity Unit seems something different, and it will be interesting to see how it holds up over time, but it seems a much better model. But it's notable that no other federation has really followed the IAAF's lead so far. And if you look at the IOC Ethics Commission, which was set up after the Salt Lake City corruption scandal in the late 1990s, it still functions in the same way as when it's set up, which is you have an ethics and compliance officer who is a member of the administrative staff. If a case comes up, they choose whether they want to refer it or not to a so-called independent ethics commission. That commission then carries out some sort of analysis, but only has the power to make a recommendation back to the executive board, who then make a final decision. So it's a completely closed system. There's no independence, and it's interesting that the IOC seem to be pushing most international federations to follow this model rather than the Athletics Integrity. I'm off to Baku tonight for WADA meetings, and they're setting up an ethics commission. It will be interesting to see which pattern they follow. I suspect it will be the IOC one. And the only thing you can really conclude from this is that the main aim of an ethics commission is not to uncover cases of corruption or crime, as Jens labelled it, but more to cover it up, to refer something to an ethics commission. And then I think with the IOC, we often see them almost use that as an excuse not to talk about it. So they can't give a comment because it's under ethics investigations. And there's several cases, individuals at the moment, Sheikh Ahmed Fahad al-Sabah from Kuwait, who's the head of the Association of National Olympic Committees. He's subject to an investigation in the US, and the IOC referred it to their ethics commission, and nothing's happened. They've just been silent. He's still just as influential, just as powerful. There's also a case involving another IOC member, Alex Galadi from Israel, who's of sexual harassment, and again, the IOC haven't done anything. They've just referred it to the ethics commission and basically kicked it into the long grass. So, for me, this doesn't work, and we should certainly be looking at other models like the Athletics Integrity Unit, but under the current system, I can't really see that happening because sports bodies don't generally want to relinquish that power. They just want to talk about good governance but not actually do anything about it. So for me, what's also interesting is whenever you have a scandal in sport, it's invariably, it emerges due to journalists, due to whistleblowers, due to an external body like the FBI with football, and it never emerges from the sports body. There's very few examples, and certainly we often feel as journalists that we are treated as the enemy by the IOC and sports bodies rather than the people involved in corruption, which I think kind of sums up part of the problem. In terms of recommendations, I would say that there should be some sort of more powerful external regulator like you have in other industries, and sport is incapable of policing itself. I wasn't going to mention the fox guarding the hen house, because we hear that way too much from Travis Tiger, but he is kind of right, and that system doesn't work. The other thing I would say is that the two international federations who I think have done the best in reforming in the last few years are the IAAF and the International Biathlon Union. And they're the two federations that have probably had the biggest scandals involving corruption and their presidents in relation to Russian doping. So I think perhaps the best way to actually properly reform these sports bodies is to get to the bottom of what's going on and create more scandals, and then maybe they'll be under pressure then to actually introduce genuine reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Not journalist to journalist? Okay, okay.
I was looking forward to a question.
Are you sure? Okay. Thanks, Nick. We will now have the panel, so I invite the four of you to join us up here. In all fairness, I should be mentioning that we have invited the IOC as well as ASWAF and FIFA and other organizations mentioned during this session, but for some reason they didn't either have time or interest, or I don't know, but they have been invited for sure. You should know that. So they did have a chance to defend themselves, but they didn't take it. We will open the panel with the question from the back, I think, because I had to reject that earlier. Luca? Yes.
I could probably shout.
Okay. We'll give you the mic anyway.
And I expect I may represent a fairly minority view here, as I used to be head of communications for the Olympic Games at the IOC. Hello, Mark Cooper.
Welcome.
So my question is actually for Paulina, who said that athletes don't receive any money from the Olympic Games. And to be provocative, that's patently untrue. If you look at the US Olympic Committee, for example, they gave $29 million last year directly to athletes, and that's money that comes straight from the Olympic Games. In addition to that was a further $88 million that was spent on athlete programs. If you look at national Olympic committees, if you look at national federations, and national federations receive funding in turn from international federations and so on, they're giving money to athletes. So clearly athletes are receiving money from the Olympic Games. I think the question is, are athletes getting to direct how much money they're receiving, and are they getting to direct the way in which the money is received? So I think it would be useful to perhaps explore that point a little.
Yes, surely it's interesting, but the money that you are referring to are coming from national Olympic committees, and it depends from one country to another, and it depends hugely on every sport. And I would be very careful about including certain things as athlete support or athlete personnel or development programs and things like that into the money that athletes should actually receive for the work that they are providing us when they are performing during the games. So this is in this way that I was referring to that.
Thank you. Ayo, another question?
Hi, Zeppel, German Television ARD. It's more a remark, but also a question. First of all, Mr. Cooper, I'm really sorry what you are talking about. It's really interesting, but you are right that a lot of money is going to athletes, but not enough. That is a problem. And if you have in mind that Mr. Bach, as a president of the IOC, is living in a hotel roof apartment, he is flying first class, he is living in a 5-star hotel all around the world. Can you explain, Mr. Cooper, how does it work together? That the leader was claiming in his opening ceremony speeches at the Olympic Games always about athletes are the core of sports and athletes are the key persons of all. And can you explain me how does it fit? I have no explanation for that. And this question goes to Mr. Cooper. And to Paulina, do you think it's time now to think about that, having in mind that obviously Mr. Bach is absolutely reluctant, I wouldn't call it hesitant, it's more reluctant, to really allow athletes to have more power in sports in general. Would you think it's time for a real athletes union, a global athletes union? But first of all, I would like to understand Mr. Cooper to give me maybe an answer on that.
Hi, there's a reason I don't work at the IOC anymore. Sorry?
Is that the answer?
Yes, there's a reason I don't work at the IOC anymore.
Say it again, Mark, please.
There's a reason I don't work at the IOC anymore. Okay.
Okay, Paulina?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I agree. That is something that I would really like to see, a global athletes union. I mentioned before that we have problems with representation even in Europe. We don't have unions from all the sports. But if you look at the world globally, the situation is even more complicated. We are a part of the Global Athletes Organization, World Player Association, with the members mainly from team sports, from North America, from Europe, also from Australia and so on. But obviously we are not representing all the sports, and we are definitely not representing all the areas of the world. Certain problem that we have there is that we want this movement to come from athletes themselves. We are really happy to support it, and we are running certain programs in Europe, for example. If we hear something about attempts by athletes to start a union or an organization, we are always happy to help. But at the same time, we want to avoid the situation that it's being done from the top down again. We really want it to be a generic movement. So that's why this is something that it's really difficult. But I think there are some interesting developments. I'm sure you know better than me about the organization in Germany. There is something similar happening now in Lithuania. With the opposition about the athletes' rights and responsibilities declaration, we could have seen also the joint letters by the World Player Associations with the athletes' organizations from Canada, from Britain, from Germany, and US, if I recall correctly. So there is a lot of movement there, but really creating a global union that will at the same time retain these important characteristics of close contact with athletes and being a movement owned by the athletes is something very difficult, but this is something definitely that we're trying to support as much as we can.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Yes, hello, I'm Antoine Leuven. I'm from the ASEAN Institute in The Hague. I'm a senior researcher there working on international sports law. And my question is remark for Nick, and I think for all the journalists which are in the room, because I think Nick pointed at something that is really important. Sports governance will not change by itself. There needs to be some type of a shadow, a public threat. It can be a threat that comes from losing sponsorship because of big scandals, but it can also be a threat that comes through the intervention of the EU institutions. So we have been pushing forward with my colleague Ben van Rompuy the ICU case, which is a bit an elephant in the room, not touched upon, but which is really important because it can shift the bargaining power inside the sporting governing bodies. But one thing that I want to point out in particular is you guys need to do the investigatory work on the pseudo-independent bodies inside the sports organizations and the CAS. You need to try to evidence how they are connected. And the recent football leagues have shown very much how the FIFA president is involved in the FIFA ethics committee, involved in the drafting of the FIFA ethics code. There is a lot that needs to be shown to the world in terms of the lack of independence of bodies that are presented as independent, and in particular the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is key. It's not really about culture, it's about structures and institutions.
Thank you. There were lots of really interesting points there. I think the first one about sponsorship, it's interesting that in virtually all of these corruption scandals in FIFA and elsewhere, the sponsors haven't left. They have sometimes, but usually they stay there, and that's, I think, a problem, because the priority for most of these sports bodies is money, and if they still get the money from TV companies, from sponsors, they're not really going to have an incentive to change. The ISU situation is really interesting with the rival league, and we've seen it again in the last week in FINA. I don't really understand the ISC argument at all there about protecting, because at the end of the day, these leagues come in and they offer a good product to athletes, and athletes often in many Olympic sports, as we've said, don't have a lot of money, don't have a good income, so it seems to be completely against kind of market forces to stop them participating in these leagues, but it's all about power and control and controlling the money. And I think it's great that the EU Commission have got involved and are taking a stand there, and the ISC are putting in a huge lobbying effort in Brussels and elsewhere to try and influence them, so it will be really interesting to how that turns out. And CAS, I think, I mean, a lot of our focus has been on WADA and how there's huge influence from sport in WADA. I'm not so much an expert on the running of CAS, but obviously the fact that the president is perhaps the #1 ally of Thomas Bach, the president of the ISC, as John Coates, who was until recently an ISC vice president, and I'm not a legal expert, but I certainly understand that sports bodies have big influence in the way arbitrators are chosen for CAS panels. So it's a difficult argument, but I think I wouldn't really trust CAS to make an independent decision a lot of the time, and I think we've seen an increasing number of athletes going to civil laws and other courts outside the sporting sphere, and I think that's something the ISC will try and stop, but it's probably a good way to improve governance and independence.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro Oliveira from Italy. First, a remark about CAS, just mentioned by Nick. From the future hearings, there could be, upon certain conditions, the public hearings could be open, and I think the media can play a role in that. So this is first thing. The other thing, when you said something earlier about Arnout's situation and other sports body situation and the role of the IOC Ethics Committee, something happened with the IBA, Boxing Association, because the Ethics Committee, IOC Ethics Committee, came out big time, I would say, and nonetheless, 84 member federations agreed to vote on the candidate that was supposed to be elected according to the IOC. So the IOC, I believe, took a position on this.
That was more of a comment, correctly?
Comment, and yeah, I would like to hear from the stage what they would like to say.
Anyone?
Yeah, the IBA situation is really interesting. I think the IOC have seemingly taken a stand, but I'd wait and see how far they actually go on that, because my instinct is that they've kind of tried to call it IBA's bluff, threatening all sorts, and now IBA have elected this guy, Gefil Rakimov, who's listed in the US Treasury as a crime boss. So the IOC have said that they will maybe take IBA out of controlling boxing at the Olympics and set up some sort of new body. I don't really know how they'll go about doing that in practice. It sounds something that makes a good headline but might be quite difficult to implement. But again, the fact that Rakimov was elected despite the IOC pressure just kind of shows this whole structure that he promised all sorts, used development money, used all his influence. And the IOC did take a stand, as you said, in saying that he shouldn't be elected, but they waited a long, long time, and there's been all sorts of scandals in boxing for years, including the alleged match fixing at the Olympics. So I don't think we should praise the IOC too much, because they waited until it was arguably too late.
Thank you. I actually have a question for Brad, and it relates to the decision in the IAAF to establish the AIU. Why do you think that happened? What was the motivating factor? Was it because of threats from sponsors to withhold sponsorships, or was it the scandals disclosed in the media, or what was the decisive factor in making that move, do you think?
Well, I of course wasn't there at the time. I can only surmise it was a combination of things. I certainly think loss of sponsors did have an impact in the IAAF case. I also think there were some good motivations in there as well to leave a legacy for the sport and in a good space also. I certainly think, having been involved now, that the IAAF sees the success of the AIU as a key to its commercial future as well, because there's an alignment on getting sponsors and presenting the sport in a good light, certainly, which I think is a good position to be in. Yeah, so I think it's a combination of those things.
Why do you think other sports haven't yet gone the same way?
Well, I think, as has been discussed already, there are entrenched positions in sport, and the IAAF was at such a low ebb, and it was reform was one of the few options to take the organisation forward and to take athletics forward. They were losing sponsors, and so it was. They were highly motivated. There was high motivation for change.
Yeah.
Actually, those were examinations, so that was it.
Sorry. There was one at the back as well.
Ryan Gauthier from Canada. I think Christina took my question, unfortunately, but I see the face she's making as well. But I want to pose this to all the members of the panel. From the North American perspective, the US Olympic Committee has said last week it might just tear down US gymnastics because of the past years of sexual abuse and the failure to investigate sexual abuse in gymnastics. When we had sexual harassment led to the overhaul of the Canadian Olympic Committee as well. So the question I have for the panel is this really the only way we're going to get true reform? Is this requirement of hitting rock bottom, that we have the corruption, or we have 30 years of sexual abuse, and finally somebody says enough, burns it down and builds it back up? Is that really what we're stuck with? Is the incremental stuff that we're doing with the research, is that of any value? Is it really increment or burn it down? Your thoughts on that?
So I'll just kick things off, because I hope it's not, because I hope through the AIU we can provide a successful example of how this reform process works in a positive way to not only rehabilitate the image of the sport, but actually to be a competitive advantage for sports, to have a really, really strong reputation for athletics, for us to be known by fans and the public as the cleanest sport, the fairest sport. So hopefully in the longer term that's not the only way, but I'll leave it to the other panelists to comment.
Is it time for an instrument to stand including sanctions? Or do we need to hit rock bottom first?
I think it's instrumental to have means of pressures, and what the journalists are doing, the criminal law is doing, it's increased pressure. Now, in an intergovernmental perspective, there is not yet consensus for an increased regulation of the sports movement by the government, and it's a huge debate. But to answer the question from the colleague, I think that there is a clear identification of the key challenges for the sports movement in terms of safeguarding policies, gender equality, good governance, but the issue is that it's not possible to address and to tackle all the problems at the same time. And sometimes the news, the scandals are helping to set the priorities. But I'm sometimes a bit skeptical when I see huge packages of good governance requirements that pretend to address all the issues at the same time, because it's likely to knock out every sports organization. And the issue of setting priorities, it's very important. We are very much involved in challenging and supporting sports organizations to have safeguarding policies against gender-based violence, sexual violence against children. But I don't think that there is a magic band called good governance that would at once address all the questions at the same time.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to that really quickly. One is that a lot of the reforms we've seen, we talked about earlier, I think are very incremental. So, for example, publishing financial reports, which is great, all federations should do it, but they're not always accurate. Publishing minutes of meetings, again, it should be done, but minutes are often a work of fiction. So I agree with the question, I don't think these incremental reforms would work. And to come directly to the gymnastics issue, I was discussing this with someone last night, and the US Olympic Committee were under pressure from external forces in America, like the Congress, who have huge control over funding. And it certainly could be argued that they only acted eventually too late to protect themselves and to ensure that their structure is protected. So again, sports bodies are only doing anything when they're under pressure from external bodies.
I think it's a very good question, and I agree with many of the comments that were expressed before. I think from our perspective, we have always tried to work in a constructive way with the sports organizations, but as I mentioned before, if we're trying to propose some reforms and change the status quo, we are told that we are destroying the sport, while actually you're right, there are many big changes that are happening, or attempts to reforms after scandals and crimes. We would also think that maybe a court case, or such as the mentioned case at the ASU, case at the Commission, would bring some change to the federation who are not willing to engage in the reforms themselves. We were thinking exactly the same thing as Nick expressed, that these commercial entities are proposing better conditions of competing to athletes. So that would, in a way, have to make the international federation to step up their game and reform in a way that they would be more competitive and propose more attractive conditions to athletes. But as we are seeing, it is not happening. Even after the decision from the Commission. So we are seeing such a strong resistance from the sports movement, in my opinion, for any kind of peaceful way of trying to reform the governance, that I'm afraid that we will still have to follow the way of from one scandal to another.
Okay, so it seems we're faced with the journey to rock bottom before anything major reforms happen. Jens? Had a question,
Yes, a question. I was not there standing for the first 2 minutes of your presentation, so you may have mentioned it. But actually, EPAS, the Council of Europe, is also acting on behalf of UNESCO and UNESCO's aspirations to embark on the area on sports integrity and with particular emphasis on the good governance area. So what takes place in the Council of Europe and in this IPACS partnership can actually influence beyond Europe, hopefully. But how do you see the chances that governments can actually agree? Because we have seen in the foundation of WADA that it was possible to establish WADA only because there were a few really activist governments. But then now we have also most lately seen that when very important geopolitical interests are at stake for the sports movement and for the countries, there is really cracks in the unity and the hope that governments as such will act against big integrity failures is weakened. So very specifically, what would you see as the benchmark of success of IPACS when talking about a plenary? How many countries would you like to see, and when do you think there will be a binding cooperation?
But I still have question marks on the plenary, but I hope that by the end of 2019, with UNODC, which is the United Nations Organization Against Drug and Crime, there will be possible to gather a representative from most governments to discuss and endorse this ongoing process of IPACS. And I would say that we have started to discuss and to challenge the governance of sports organization in 2004 at interministerial level. And it took another 10 years until it was possible to address in an open way the issue of corruption in sport. It was in 2014. But since this date, the effort has not decreased, and it's still the #1 issue on the political agenda for the ministers responsible for sport. And I think that the movement will go growing, and that the ability of IPACS to deliver some concrete outcomes is awaited by the political leaders. And they won't be satisfied with window dressing or nice declarations. So we are all under pressure to deliver with this process.
We'll hold you up on the last points then, to make sure that something happens and the EPAS and the politicians don't get complicit with the status quo. Question here?
Hello. My name's Anne McFarland. I'm from Ireland. I'm an author of a book on corporate governance, and my background is more corporate governance than sport. I have been involved in various sporting boards, and one of the things that strikes me is that we get people who know a lot about the sport, possibly not enough athletes, but we get people who know a lot about the sport. But as we saw in the very first presentation, we get no independent directors, and that line was red right across. I believe in the answer to the question of what can be done. I think independent directors are absolutely vital, and they have the overview, and I would be interested in the comments of the panel on that role.
Anyone on the panel has a comment or an answer to that?
As long as they are genuinely independent, because independent is one of those infuriating words, and often, like for example, Ban Ki-moon is chair of the independent IOC Ethics Commission, that he's been hobnobbing with the IOC for years as UN Secretary General, so I don't really see him as independent, but certainly, yeah, having that outside experience. I think Paul Dayton, as the chief executive of the London 2012 organising committee, came from outside sport and had a really good perspective. It's not quite the same as it's an organising committee, but certainly having business people is a good thing, yeah.
We have room for a few more questions before the lunch break, so anyone? Yep.
My name is Juan Manuel, I'm from Peru. I wanted to get a recommendation or something for emerging countries like mine which are dealing with huge corruption scandals, not just in politics but also in sports. Just to point out a case, the Football Federation passed a bill to the Congress. It was in order to follow the plan that FIFA established for them, but also in the meantime, there was a huge accusation for the president of the Football Federation, accused of leading a criminal organization. When everyone, like the fans and everyone, started to ask him what's going on, the Congress tried to kick the bill out, and the FIFA replied as investigating the Football Federation for the intervention of the government. Where should we start? It seems like every time we're trying to make a change, these organizations are closed and say like, no, this interference. The fans don't have how to say it. Should start with the players, with the fans, with the media. Where do you think we should start with this change in emerging countries like us?
Looking at the panel. Stan, do you have a comment on that? Nick, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think we talk a lot about independence in sport, but also governments aren't always independent, as we see with anti-doping. You can't really trust a government always in the same way. So I think it's not just the sports industry that's flawed. I think it's not really relevant for Peru, but on a general sense, the way athletes have felt much more able to speak out in the last few weeks, months, in a much more noticeable way than before is a really good sign, and is putting some real pressure on in anti-doping. And at the moment it's only from a handful of countries, mainly in the Western sphere. And I think they're trying to involve more athletes in other places like Asia, Africa, Latin America, and try and make them feel comfortable in speaking out as well. And I think if that becomes bigger and bigger, sport will have to listen.
Just a short comment to add on that, because you mentioned football, and actually football is the most unionized sport in the world, with I think 65 country members from all around the world, and I would imagine that there is probably a union in Peru already, or maybe there's a union in some of the country next to Peru, which would definitely give a little bit of an opportunity to get in dialogue with that organization and try to use their experience of over 50 years in dealing with FIFA, and we're trying to develop organizations like this. Because one thing that is obviously the most drastic ways of athletes trying to put pressure on sports governing bodies is going on strike, because they actually do have this opportunity, and very often even just a threat to go on strike and make a change overnight, and we have seen that. Obviously that depends on the situation in particular country and sport and so on. But I would advise you to try to get within that player movement in football.
Thank you. Jens?
It's a comment to that question. I'll just say that when it comes to fighting corruption in sport, we are all in emerging countries. It's and you are in no way in Peru in a worse situation than anywhere else. It's you have had a judicial system strong enough to put corrupt presidents or ex-presidents in prison. I know it's complicated, Latin American politics. I'm not diminishing the difficulties, but I'll just say it's just getting started. My mind flew back to the very first Play the Game conference 21 years ago, where it was actually the first time that journalists and sports officials and researchers got together to discuss this kind of issues. And on the very first day, Andrew Jennings, the famous British investigative journalist, gave an arousing speech about fascism in the IOC and corruption in the federations and right arm waving people and I don't know what. It was very colorful. And then one African journalist stood up, and there were quite a few Africans around, and they said, yeah, but my editor is good friends with the head of National Olympic Committee, how can I write about scandals? And the answer was, I would say, and has been key to play the game's relative success over the years, network. There's not one solution, just find like-minded people, do what you can to make alliances, network, seminars, meetings, actions, and things will start happening. Not very easily, but network with those people. You have athlete groups in Peru, I'm sure. You have researchers in Peru, you have journalists in Peru, you probably also have some very well-intentioned sports leaders who are not all corrupt. And so, yeah, just go at it and things will happen.
And I think on that note, keep fighting hard. Everybody, we will close this session. Thank you very much to the panel, first of all. I think it was some very interesting perspectives on international sport governance we've had. Maybe we haven't had that many conclusions, or we don't leave the room all certain of exactly what to do, but we've had various issues presented that we can continue looking at, so thank you all for that. And thank you for you and your interesting questions. I think it's been very good. Lunch is served outside in the hallway. I was told to say that if you wish soup, it's in the restaurant further down the hall. But otherwise, we'll have a break now for 1 hour, and we'll see you back here at 1:30, I believe.
Ja, goed. De trouwe bezoeker van de kleding.
Ik vind dat we dat op zijn minst één directeur